Picture this. You wake up on a Tuesday morning to the low, guttural grinding of concrete mixers tearing through the silence of a valley that's been quiet since before your grandfather learned how to walk. And the first thing that hits you ISN and oppos. T the sunrise, it and oppos. S the acrid. Choking smell of diesel exhaust mixing with the dust of crushed limestone filling your lungs as you watch $80,000 of neighbor-funded money get poured directly into a crystal-clear mountain stream. It's a sight that'll turn your stomach, especially when you see a woman like Victoria Sterling standing there, leaning against her white Tesla with those oversized sunglasses and a smirk that says she owns the clouds above and the dirt below, casually announcing to the neighborhood that she's, in quote, fixing, in quote, the landscape for flood control, but what this high-stakes real estate queen didn't in oppos. T account for was the fact that I'm a retired senior hydrologist for the Bureau of Land Management. And she didn't in oppos. T just built a drainage ditch. She just wired a hydraulic time bomb that's pointed straight at her own million-dollar foundation. My name is Silas Thorne. I'm 62 years old. And until about a year ago, I figured the biggest fight left in my life would be haggling over the price of old gaskets for my 1968 Chevy C10. But life has a funny way of reminding you that sometimes the most dangerous predator in the wild, ISN and oppos. T, a mountain lion, and oppos. S, a HOA board president who thinks a weekend seminar on luxury landscaping is the same thing as a degree in civil engineering. I live on a 3-acre slice of heaven in the foothills of Montana, a place my family has called home since the late 1800s, long before the town of Silver Creek was anything more than a trading post and a few head of cattle. And the only thing we ever cared about was the health of Spirit Creek, a waterway that winds through the property like a silver ribbon. My father was a man who believed that if you took care of the land would keep you sane. And for 30 years, following the same ritual every morning, coffee on the porch, listening to the creek babble over smooth river stones, the scent of pine needles and damp earth, was my version of church, a way to keep the world at bay while I tinkered in my workshop with old engines and mechanical ghosts. My wife, Elena, is a woman with a heart like a quiet lake. She spent her life teaching history to middle schoolers, which means she's developed a level of patience that borderlines on the supernatural. But even she knew that when the developers started carving up the ridgeline to build the Heights at Silver Creek, things were going to get messy. The Heights was one of those subdivisions where the houses all look like different versions of the same beige dream, populated mostly by folks who moved out here to, in quote, connect with nature, in quote, but then spent every waking hour trying to pave over anything that wasn't an oppos. A manicured lawn. And at the center of it all was Victoria, a woman who treated the HOA presidency like she was the governor of a small, very entitled nation. The first shot in this war didn't in oppos. Come from a bulldozer. It came in a manila envelope, a certified letter claiming that my, in quote, unauthorized collection of vintage industrial equipment, in quote, which most people call a hobby, and I call my life an oppos. S-work was a visual nuisance that violated the community's aesthetic harmony, and they were hitting me with a $200 a day fine until I, in quote, remedied, in quote, the situation. Now, the funny thing is my property predates their entire development by over a century, and the original deeds contain ironclad easements and water rights that were signed back when people still carried lanterns, but Victoria wasn't and oppos. Interested in history. She was interested in property values, and in her mind, a guy in grease-stained overalls living on the edge of her, in quote, perfect, in quote, kingdom was a stain on the ledger. We had a face-to-face meeting in her office, a place that smelled like expensive vanilla candles and cold ambition, where she told me, with a smile that never quite reached her eyes, that maybe I'd be, in quote, more comfortable, in quote, in a community that shared my lifestyle choices, which is just suburban code for, in quote, you're too poor to be my neighbor, in quote. And I just looked her dead in the eye and told her that the law doesn't and oppos. Care about her vibes. It cares about titles, and my title was. Here before her Tesla was a sketch on a whiteboard. That's when things turned ugly, because a woman like Victoria doesn't and oppos. Handled the word, in quote, no, in quote, very well, and she decided that if she couldn't and oppos sue me off my land, she'd use the creek to do it, claiming that the natural flow of Spirit Creek was, in quote, unstable, in quote, and threaten the structural integrity of the luxury homes downstream. She hired a firm of high-priced consultants who produced a 50-page report full of technical jargon that basically said the creek needed to be, in quote, modernized, end quote, which is just a fancy way of saying they wanted to turn a living, breathing ecosystem into a concrete gutter so they could build more patio space without worrying about the spring runoff. I tried to warn them. I literally went to the board meeting with my old hydrologic maps and decades of flow data to show them that the creek and oppos meanders were exactly what prevented flooding, that the soil absorption in the wetlands was the only reason their basements weren't in oppos, already swimming pools. But Victoria just looked at me like I was a senile old man talking about the weather and moved to approve the, in quote, emergency flood mitigation project, in quote, without a second thought. I remember standing by the water the night before the construction started, feeling the weight of my father's legacy in the very air, and Elena came out and put her hand on my shoulder and asked me what I was going to do. And I told her that sometimes you have to let people build their own gallows just so you can watch them realize how high the drop is. While they were busy pouring tons of concrete into that delicate creek bed, destroying the trout habitats and burying the history of the valley under a layer of gray industrial sludge, I was busy in my workshop, not with a wrench, but with a camera and a legal pad, documenting every single violation of the Clean Water Act and every unauthorized modification to a navigable waterway. See, Victoria thought she was playing a local game of HOA politics, but when you mess with a mountain stream in this part of the country, you're playing a federal game with the EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers, and they don and oppos. Give a damn about your vanity plates or your real estate commissions. The height of the insanity came when I found out that the construction company Victoria hired, Sterling Infrastructure, owned by her husband's brother, Real Subtle, was charging the HOA homeowners nearly triple the market rate for the work, and they were cutting corners that would make a slumlord blush, using low-grade concrete and ignoring the bedrock depth entirely. I had a young ally in this, a kid named Leo who lived in one of the newer houses and happened to be a forensic accountant who was tired of seeing his monthly dues disappear into a black hole of, in quote, maintenance fees, end quote. And together we started pulling on a thread that began with a creek and ended with a massive web of embezzlement and kickbacks. We spent nights looking over bank statements and shell company filings, the smell of old paper and stale coffee becoming our new normal, and it turns out Victoria wasn't and oppos. Just trying to, in quote, improve, end quote, the neighborhood. She was using the HOA as her personal piggy bank to fund a lifestyle her real estate commissions couldn't and oppos quite cover anymore. The tension in the valley was thick as mountain fog as spring approached, because anyone who's lived in Montana long enough knows that the snowpack doesn't end oppos. Just melt it and oppos. It's a seasonal assault on the lowlands, and this year was looking like a record breaker. I watched as the water levels started to rise, hitting that new concrete channel with the ferocity the designers hadn't in oppos. Accounted for, because while concrete is strong, it in oppos. It's also rigid, and it doesn't in oppos. Have the, in quote, give, end quote, of a natural bank or the absorption of a wetland. Instead of the water slowing down and soaking into the earth, it was being funneled into a high-pressure jet, a literal water cannon aimed directly at the bend where the most expensive houses sat. And every morning I'd take my measurements and just shake my head, knowing that physics doesn't in oppos. Take bribes and gravity doesn't in oppos. Care about your social standing. The day of the Great Reckoning came on a Friday in mid-May, the kind of day where the sky is a bruised purple and the rain is coming down in sheets that blur the line between the earth and the heavens. And I got a call from Leo telling me that the basement of the Sterling mansion was already taking on water. I drove down to the edge of the property line and saw the chaos unfolding. Victoria was out there in a designer raincoat, screaming at a group of terrified contractors as the creek, now a roaring, chocolate-colored monster, was leaping over the sides of her precious concrete channel and carving a new path directly through her manicured gardens. The concrete was cracking under the sheer weight of the hydraulic pressure, pieces of it breaking off and becoming battering rams that were slamming into the very foundations they were supposed to protect, and the irony was so thick you could taste it in the rain. My property, just a few hundred yards upstream, was perfectly fine because the natural wetlands I'd fought to protect were doing exactly what they'd done for 10,000 years, acting like a sponge, soaking up the excess and letting the rest pass by in a controlled, rhythmic flow. We ended up in a federal courtroom in Helena a few months later, and let me tell you, there's nothing quite as satisfying as watching a woman like Victoria Sterling realize that her, in quote, connections, in quote, Don and Oppos, mean a thing when a federal judge is looking at high-definition drone footage of a destroyed ecosystem and a paper trail of embezzled funds. Her lawyer tried to argue that the flood was an, end quote, act of God, end quote, but our expert witnesses, including my old colleagues from the BLM, testified that it was an, end quote, act of gross negligence, end quote, and a direct result of the unauthorized modifications to the creek bed. When the judge handed down the ruling, it wasn't an Oppos, just a win for me. It was a total dismantling of everything Victoria had built. She was ordered to pay for the full restoration of the creek, hit with millions in federal fines, and the forensic audit Leo provided led to a criminal indictment for fraud and money laundering that saw her being led out of the courthouse in the kind of jewelry she was and Oppos. Used to wearing handcuffs. Today, Spirit Creek is finally starting to look like itself again. The concrete has been hauled away, the willows are being replanted, and the sound of the water babbling over the stones is back to being the soundtrack of my mornings. But the neighborhood is a different place now. The heights at Silver Creek ISN and Oppos. A kingdom anymore and Oppos. As a community of people who realize that the guy in the grease-stained overalls might actually know a thing or two about the land they're living on, and I spend a lot of my time now helping other folks figure out how to live with nature instead of trying to beat it into submission. But I have to wonder when I see the news about more and more of these cookie-cutter developments popping up in places they Don and Oppos. Belong, how many other, in quote, Victorias, in quote, are out there right now pouring concrete into the heart of the wild just to save a few bucks on a patio? It makes you think about what we're actually willing to trade for a, in quote, perfect, in quote, view, and whether we even deserve the land if we aren't in Oppos. Willing to listen to what it's trying to tell us. So, if you got an HOA story that makes your blood boil, or if you've had to stand your ground against a neighbor who thought they could pave over your peace of mind, I want to hear it in the comments, because the more we talk about this, the harder it is for people like Victoria to hide in the shadows of their beige developments. Is it ever worth it to fight your own community to save the land, or should we just let the concrete win and move on? Let me know what you think, and if you want to see how we're rebuilding the creek one stone at a time, hit that subscribe button and stay tuned, because out here, the story never really ends. It just keeps flowing.